with what we're talking about. So I'll continue our study there starting in verse 4, and then we'll move onward. So here's when Paul is talking about having confidence in the flesh, and we know, as we talked about before, when he was concerning the flesh, he was talking about the old law or the old covenant and how Paul used to be. And if we get to it tonight, we'll do some lengthy reading, I'll call it, because we're going to get into some things about how Paul used to be and how he was converted. And where we'll find those accounts would be Acts 9, and his version, or talking about it, will be in Acts 22, and then also in Acts 26 when he talks to King Agrippa about his conversion. But we're not there yet, so there may be the possibility we do get there and talk about that in a little bit of detail. But starting in verse 4, Paul says, "Though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more." In verse 5, "Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee." Verse 6, "Concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless." So going back to verse 4, Paul is saying here that I also had a great confidence in the flesh. If anyone thinks they have confidence in the flesh, I would be considered a more prime example. And I think Paul has all the right to say that, because where he was before, persecuting Christians also, but when it came to the Jewish traditions and Jewish culture, he was very well versed. He knew the Hebrew language, he knew how they lived, and he followed the customs of the Jews. And this was something that was very much in his nature to do, because he was brought about that way. And I want to say, if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll try to seek you out. And if raise it high. Sometimes I see people scratching their ear, and I'm like, "You got something?" So don't scratch your ears. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so in verse 5, it says, "Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee." So that part, circumcised the 8th day, this is referenced in Genesis 17, 9 through 12. We'll go ahead and go there really quick. Genesis 17, 9 through 12. And I'll read that. And it says, "And God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man child in your generations, he that is born in the house, or bought with money of any stranger which is not of thy seed." So we have that reference of the old law given by Abraham, or given to Abraham by God, that on the 8th day the male child was to be circumcised. So, and this is about how babes were to be circumcised as told by God to Abraham there. "And of the stock of Israel," and we talked about this, Paul's ancestry was pure enough to grant him proper status among the Jews. And that's basically what Paul's saying. I was of the stock of Israel. That he was of that, and very much part of that. So he was through and through one born of Israel, and he was also born into the tribe of Benjamin specifically. And this is something that we talked about with Jewish lineage here. They would follow out and seek their lineage. They would very much hold true to the records, and that was very important to them, and they kept that very sacred. So Paul was able to trace his lineage back to the tribe of Benjamin there. So, an Hebrew of Hebrews, this was Paul's native tongue, which would be proper in Jewish standards. He was raised by Jewish, considering themselves Pharisees. And we know even so, the Pharisees even tried to trip up Jesus when it came to the law. They tried to do everything they could to make sure that they held exactly to the law, but even in fact, they couldn't be more wrong with what they were doing, because Jesus was the true doctrine there. Does anybody have any questions or comments up to verse 6? Okay. Verse 6 says, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. So when it came to zealous acts, Paul persecuted the church. Let's go ahead and go to Acts 22, verse 3. And this is just a small bit of what we'll be talking about in a little bit. But it says here, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye are all this day. And I think in the American Standard Version, the translation for that, the type of teaching of Gamaliel was strict. And he was a very strict teacher for Paul. A good one. It was something that Paul learned a lot, or someone that Paul learned a lot from. It's hard to say. But he very much took those teachings to heart when he was taught of Gamaliel. And so this is kind of going a little bit in the history of who Paul was learned by. And this further explains Paul's credentials, but also that manner of which he followed the law. Let's go ahead and go to Galatians 1, 13 and 14 as well. And this will shed some light on kind of the way and manner of what Paul was towards the church. Galatians 1, 13 and 14. It reads, for ye have heard of my conversation in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God, and wasted it, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. So we know that when Paul was doing the things that he was doing for the Jewish religion, he was persecuting the church, and as we see that, it's hurtful and horrible to think about, because he did some very horrific things. But in his eyes, in his mind, he thought he was doing what was right. And he laid waste to the church. Did he get rid of it? No. No one can get rid of God's kingdom. No one can get rid of the church. And I know many have tried over the time of centuries, but Paul was one of those who had such a vigor, such a zeal, such a, I don't even know how to explain it. It was in the bowels of oneself that he wanted to push and do whatever he could when it came to his objective. His drive was severe, I would say. So also, this talks about how Paul wreaked havoc upon the church to profit the Jewish religion. This was his goal. And he had full confidence in the law and considered himself righteous. He was blameless according to the law, and the intense focus this man had for his motives were unparalleled. He had a vigorous drive. So I just want us to understand the kind of drive that Paul had against the church. And we're going to, in a little bit, see how that changes when we do read about Paul's conversion. The drive that he had for persecuting the church versus the drive he has for Christ. I tend to believe, and this is just my personal belief, so don't hold any stock into it, that he has more of a drive for Christ than he did persecuting the church, because now there's an objective that he knew he was wrong, he wants to make right. And I think Russ had a really good point last time when Paul was converted. it wasn't something where he could just say, I'm not going to persecute the church anymore. I'm going to live my life and kind of go about my life meagerly Christian. No, he said, I'm going to do whatever I can to preach Christ. He was so vigorous, so zealous, if that's the right word, to preach Christ and show others the true gospel. And so I really think that that's a neat thing, that such a person could be so aggressive in his teaching one way, and just as aggressive, if not more, in the correct way. And so, even so, when he's talking to King Agrippa, he puts out his account, I got you, Gary, of how he used to be trying to use that as a teaching tool, trying to use that as a conversion tool. I used to be that person who persecuted the church. Go ahead, Gary.
God knew that whenever he picked him to be, to do what he had to do. So, it wasn't an accident. He knew his personality, and he knew that, if I get him going in the right direction, it's like, you see people today, it's like, you can just get these people going in the right direction, we're going to do a lot of good. I see a lot of religions, false religions that are gung-ho, and, if you just turn around and get going in the right direction, you do a lot of good.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I guess you could say, denominations who, when you see them, they're very happy people. They're very, not boisterous, but they're very in tune with what they're doing, and they're very zealous to do it, and that's a great drive. And sometimes we could have that drive too. I'm not saying roll across the floor and things like they do, the holy rollers and stuff like that. I'm not talking about that. But you do see some people truly feel in their heart they're doing the right thing. And that was Paul. He absolutely thought he was doing the right thing in his heart. But to be guided the correct way was what needed to happen. Russ?
Throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, the Old Testament you have when idols are removed, false gods are destroyed, there's a monstrous zeal to turn to the right. You think about the defining of the law there in the Old Testament, and the zeal. Think about Gideon tearing down the altar, the Bible says, of his fathers, and the zeal that came with it. Then we find men like Paul in the New Testament. He came out of persecuting church, who did a completely turn away in the zeal that came with it. And so it's, if you think about our own conversion, how did we feel, the few moments after we were baptized? Probably ready to go talk to anybody. And so that zeal is there many times. The tricky part is maintaining it.
Right. Exactly. When Johnny had his class, which was very good, very informative, and very much appreciative of it, we talked about that part of confession, confessing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I think that's sometimes a point that's overlooked a little bit. Confessing that Jesus is the Son of God. That's so easy to say, but it's something you feel. It's something you feel. I want to tell everybody that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I want to preach Christ because I'm so excited that I get to be a Christian, that I have the opportunity to go to heaven. And that's something that we can preach to anybody. That confession that I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and He died for my sins. That's something that we can show everybody and be happy about it. And we should have a not aggressive, but a vigorous way when we become Christians. And I've heard this before. I was born in the church, I would say, or that phrase. A lot of my family were Christians, and I was afforded the opportunity to be taught by them, and I'm very thankful of that. But I understand not everybody was. Some people had to be shown by someone else outside of their family, perhaps, the true love of Christ. And when they come to that realization, I can't imagine what that's like. But for those who I have spoken with that have been converted, that's a very special time for them. It might be a little bit difficult at first, But that doesn't mean any less that we shouldn't go preach Christ. It doesn't mean any less that needs to be expressed to everyone, because I do feel there's a certain point where someone is converted, and it really makes sense to them that they're ready to talk about Christ, ready to show that to the world, if you will. And I think that's where Paul was coming from. Anybody have any comments or questions before we move on? Okay, so in verse 7, this is where Paul talks about the whole meaning and the point of all the credentials that he was making about himself. Because we talked before, he's not bragging. He's not saying, well, I was this, I was the stock of Israel, a Hebrew of Hebrews. He was saying those things, but this is the point he's going to be talking about what that means. So starting in verse 7, but what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Verse 8, yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ, Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. So in verse 7, Paul finishes his point by showing that all that he had just listed made him great according to the flesh, not through the faith, not through the Spirit, through the flesh, has no value and is counted loss for Christ. It doesn't matter the things that he did, and he threw it all away. Many countless years he spent in his life's devotion being taught by the Jews in what he thought was the right way. And I can't imagine how many hours and diligent study that he put into that religion taught by Gamaliel. And he says, I count it all loss. I count it all loss for Christ. Verse 8, there is no doubt in Paul's mind that all things were vain before coming to the knowledge of Christ. He lost all his credentials that basically formed who he was and was in his eyes meant to be. You know, this is what he thought his life was going to lead him to be. And he was persecuting the church. So he reduces all these things to the muck and mire of life because he wants to win Christ, which is the ultimate goal. And that's when Paul brings it all home. He's saying all the things that I was, a Pharisee, blameless, persecuting the church, Hebrew of Hebrews, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter now. Because everything I do is for Christ. And everything that I'm going to do henceforth is for Christ. And that's what he's teaching in this epistle here in Philippians. It doesn't matter where you were. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how bad or whatever things you've done, because he has quite a list of things that he did that was bad. So this is the point where I wanted to go back to history class a little bit. Let's go ahead and go to Acts 9. And we're going to read about Paul's conversion here. Because I think this is necessary, and I think it's important that we do talk about this. And I figured, why not? Let's read it together as a class. About how important this was for Paul to change where he was to where he is now. And he has every right to say the things that he's saying. So I'll go ahead and read, because I know it's a little bit of lengthy reading. So starting in verse 9 of Acts, or chapter 9 of Acts. And Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest, and desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell on the earth, and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? Now that's something that I think, I want to stop there. That's something that is interesting. He recognized that this was deity. He recognized this was Lord. Not just because of the blinding light, but I think the whole presence that was there. And we'll find out why here as we move on. Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. So we already know at this point this is a miraculous occurrence that came here when Paul was approached by Jesus. And this isn't the time where Paul was converted, but I do believe it is the time where Paul understood, I'm talking to Christ, I'm talking to the Lord. And this is where the life turning starts to happen right here. Not his conversion, but where his life starts to change. Okay, so in verse 7, or verse 8, and Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man. But they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And he was 3 days without sight, and neither did eat nor drink. And there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias. And to him said the Lord in a vision, Ananias. And he said, Behold, I am here, Lord. And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the street, which is called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus. For behold, he prayeth. And he hath seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in, and putting his hand on him, that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many of this man how much evil he hath done to thy saints at Jerusalem. And here he hath authority from the chief priest to bind all that call on thy name. Stop right there. Ananias is scared. And for good reason. Paul was a persecutor of the church. He still did what Christ asked him to do. But as he's going to do this, when Jesus came to Ananias in this vision, he said, I need you to go to Paul. Yes, Saul of Tarsus, the one that persecuted the church. I need you to go to him. And he did obey, but I can't imagine the fear this man had to go to Paul. So let's continue on here. But the Lord saith unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear thy name before the Gentiles and the kings of the children of Israel. So this was something Jesus instituted in Paul already. This is what he's going to do. He is going to be a chosen vessel to preach the gospel. Okay? For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. Verse 17, And Ananias went his way, and entered into the house, and putting his hand on him, said, Brother Saul, the Lord even Jesus, that appeared unto thee in the way as thou camest, hath sent me, that thou mightest receive thy sight, and be filled with the Holy Ghost. And immediately there fell from his eyes as it had been scales, and he received sight forthwith, and arose and was baptized. Okay, we'll stop right there. This was a conversion of Saul. This was a conversion of a man who persecuted the church, who laid waste to it, as we read in Galatians there, that he was doing everything that he could, his zeal, his heart, against the church. And all these things, all these credentials that he talked about here in Philippians, we're done with that. That's the past. Okay? So the key that I wanted to bring out here is, as I was saying before, no matter what we've done, no matter what kind of sin we've had in our life, no matter what problems that we have done or felt, they can all be fixed. They can all be healed, and Jesus has that power, that resurrecting power. Now we know that repentance may be involved. We know that prayer is involved in things like this. But even someone as Saul, who did all these things, can still be a great vessel for Christ. And we find out he was. Absolutely he was. And I think that's an amazing story. And I think that it's necessary as we read these verses to find out what that looked like, Paul becoming a Christian. Go ahead, Jake.
What if Paul's, or if Jesus taking Paul's sight there at the beginning was in any way a foreshadow of how Paul would later lose a good portion of his vision in service to God and to Christ? And in that section of scriptures that we just read through, he talks about showing Paul what he would have to suffer for Christ's sake. So I don't know if he was, it's just something interesting I was thinking about. It's like it's, maybe he's talking about him losing his sight, or just in general, there's going to be a lot of things that he has to suffer.
Oh, sure. I believe that was foreshadow that Jesus had there, saying Paul's going to be my vessel and that he is going to suffer some great things in my name. And this is something that Paul is going to talk about in verse 9, 10, and 11 as we move on in Philippians. Some of these sufferings, but this is where the point of Paul being converted, this is where he tries to get everyone to understand where we're at when it comes to that conversion. So he's really trying to separate the old law and teaching them the new covenant. But starting in verse 1, he said, "Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you." And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. And he saith, and this is what we read before, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye are all this day. And this is where he'll start talking about his account. And I persecuted this way unto death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. And also the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. So that was his reasoning to go to Damascus. He was going to go to those who were bound, and he was going to punish them even more. He was going to mess up some more Christians. That was his job. He was going to go do that, and he had vigor and zeal to go do that. Verse 6, and it came to pass that as I made my journey, and was come nigh unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me, and I fell unto the ground, and heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And they that were with me saw indeed the light, and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there shall be told thee of all things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there, came unto me and stood and said unto me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. In the same hour I looked up upon him, and he said, The God of our fathers hath chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will, and see that just one, and shouldest hear the voice of his mouth. For thou shalt be his witness unto all men, what thou hast seen and heard. And now why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized. So again, the same exact thing that actually happened, Paul's saying happened to him. Coincidence? I don't think so, because it actually happened. Some people want to, take accounts in the Gospels and say, well, this was told one way and this was told another way. That's not exactly the truth. It's 4 different accounts, 4 different paradigms, if you will. A paradigm is a point of view or a lens that you see through a scope. And that's just a point of view someone had. Here, it's almost verbatim exactly what happened. Paul's saying exactly how he was converted. And so, verse 17, and it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance and saw him saying unto me, Make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. And Jesus is speaking there. And I said, Lord, they know that I am in prison and beaten every synagogue, them that believed on thee. So he understands the things that he did, and this might be a difficult time for him to preach Christ. And even though, if we go back to chapter 9, it's in this actually, when he said, Aren't you the same Saul that persecuted the church? And he indeed was, but he grew in strength, teaching and preaching the gospel. He used that tool of conversion to still preach Christ. Go ahead, Russ.
One of the things that stands out to me in the conversion of Saul is how quickly his life changed, not just because of his conversion, obviously becoming a Christian, but it says there in Acts 9, I think around verse 22 or so, that it wasn't many days after that the Jews had already made a plan to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
Those who he had labored with side by side previously to attack the church, well, now they're coming after him.
Yeah.
And it says there days, and so it's interesting to think about, or good for us to be mindful about, someone being converted and being baptized, how important it is to keep on teaching them, because the things leading up to conversion and the days and weeks and months following are probably the most difficult, because you're going to have big decisions to make and naysayers, and with Saul it was no different. He met Christ in the road. He was later, obeyed what he was told to do, and then days and people were trying to kill him, which tells us that his conversion was clearly seen as being legitimate, and the change immediate,
Yeah.
and the consequences follow pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And so it's a good reminder to us that when we teach the gospel to people, I realize we need to continue to teach them. It's not a obey the gospel once, but obeying the gospel and continuing to do what we need to do. And Saul faced a lot of difficulties. It began pretty quickly.
Absolutely. Thank you. Go ahead, Jake.
Just to add to that, you think about when someone is converted, a lot of times, now it shouldn't be this way, but a lot of times that's the hottest their faith is ever going to
Yeah.
be. And so what's the first thing they're going to do but go try to teach other people?
Mhm.
And so at that point, they're honestly the most vulnerable as well that they'll ever be. Yeah, their faith is strong and new, but they most likely don't have a whole lot of meat and foundation there as far as the scriptures go. And so it would be easy for them to just go and zealously try to teach people the word, talk to people about the church, and then be led astray by somebody else.
Mhm.
So like he was saying, it's super important for us to continue teaching after the conversion. A lot of people, want to get them wet, and then there's just hands-free after that.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's like having a baby and then just leaving it on somebody's doorstep or leaving it in the woods.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great point, because who's kind of the audience he's directing this towards? Obviously, it's those at Philippi. But when he was talking about the Jews, these are Jews that have been converted from what they used to be to Christianity, and they're still kind of struggling with what the old customs were in the old covenant. And he's talking about this moving over to the new covenant. That was a bit of a struggle for them. And I know Mike's talked about that in Corinthians there. This was something that takes a lot of study and a lot of time and diligence on their part as well. Go ahead, Clee.
I was just going to say, the thing that I admire about Paul, and I think about him, is he was one of the most skilled in the Old Testament scriptures.
Yep.
Of anybody around. Gamaliel was well-known, well-respected, well-honored with
Strict.
his knowledge and teaching.
Yeah.
And so Paul had this unique ability that we don't have today, that we probably should have more of, could look at the Old Testament scriptures, and once he saw who Jesus was, that he was a fulfillment of those things, how powerful was his sermons when he went and brought this before the people? Look, I lived, grew up, and understood these Old Testament scriptures. This here is showing you Jesus. This here is showing you Jesus. This here is showing you Jesus, the Messiah, the one you're looking for. He came, he's gone, he's in heaven now with his Father. And you can be there too. And how powerful would that be? But as I think too about converts, they don't have that, right? It was, I'm not going to say easier for Paul, but it was logical for Paul to understand that transition to Christianity. But people who don't have that foundation of what the Old Testament was and bringing forth Christ and bringing forth the New Testament time period,
Yeah.
it is even that much more important that we continue to teach. We
Yeah.
continue to build that foundational faith within them because they don't have that firm ground that Paul had to begin with.
Absolutely.
Just something for us to remember.
Oh, yeah, great point. And real quick, Jake, but when Christ came to Paul, how beautiful it was that he was chosen vessel. Paul was the chosen vessel. Who he was, his background, Christ knew all that. Christ knew all that and said, I'm going to take this man and he's going to be one who preaches about me. And he just converted all that, and it's an amazing story. Go ahead, Jake.
So you just kind of what he said brought this to my mind about how Paul was there and basically raised up on the Old Testament and just knew it better than anybody else.
Yeah.
And you think about how the early church was, and I mean like post-biblical times, like early churches. You look at the history and how it lines up with what the Bible says, and so we have these proofs from the early church. It's like, hey, these guys still did things the way that the Bible teaches us to do it, so we can emulate, how they did things as well. But then today you've got people that are these, Greek scholars that look back at the Greek and are like, oh, it means this. The early churches did it wrong. It's like these guys, that was their primary language was Greek. You think you know it better than people that live, breathe, sleep, ate Greek?
Yeah.
And so it's just crazy to me that people want to go back and try to add these things and change what they think it is.
Yeah.
It's wild.
No, Paul's credentials definitely lay it out there because he was saying, if your confidence in the flesh, I'm more. I did the study. I was born, of the tribe of Benjamin, stock of Israel. I knew the Hebrew. I know what I'm talking about. And for him to say, it doesn't mean anything. Christ means everything. And as we get into 9, 10, and 11 next week, this is really going to lay out what Paul talks about according to the resurrection. So thank you all. Appreciate the comments.
We'll take care of that on Sunday. All right. So, in regards to the Devo, I was kind of thinking through a good topic, and one of the things that we were talking at the house the other day, and we were talking about Noah and the ark, and one of the things, sometimes you read something, but it just doesn't click as far as you get something out of it every time you read it. And so one of the things, if you would, turn over to Genesis 7, 15 through 16. Genesis 7, 15 through 16. And it says, and they went unto Noah, and they went unto Noah and the ark, two by two, all the flesh wherein the breath of life. And they that went in, males and females of all flesh, as God had commanded him, meaning Noah. And it says, and the Lord shut him in. Now, that was kind of the key thing for me, understanding as far as what we all know what the reasoning, the intent, which we'll talk about a little bit here, but just the idea there, it says, and that the Lord shut him in. Noah's the one who actually built the ark. He's the one who put it together and took all that time, but it says, and the Lord shut him in. And so 2 things that God shows with this action. Number 1 is that based off of Noah's obedience, God shutting the door confirms he'll take care of Noah. As we know, Noah was pleasing in God's eyes. He had done what he had said. And when he closed him in, he shut that door, it was a sign that God was pleased with Noah. And so if we looked at Romans 8:28 says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. Just like Noah was called by God as far as to build the ark, we also are called, right? Us as Christians, we have that commitment, or we've given that commitment to God that we will obey him. And we understand that sometimes as Christians that we're going to have to do things that we don't want to do. Not necessarily, or more from a perspective of they're hard. Those are things like having conversations with people about Christianity or about their spiritual life. It's about giving up people or removing people from our lives that do not align with the will of God. They don't align with our goals as far as to get to heaven. And that's even tougher when it comes to family and friends. But the idea is that Noah trusted God, didn't he? He said, oh, God, I will do exactly what you said. And at the end, we can see that God took care of Noah. In Proverbs 3:5-6, it says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understandings. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Noah had met the commandments of God and should have had faith, hope, comfort, rest, that God was in control and would take care of him. As we reflect on the status of our salvation tonight, do we have that assurance? As we think about that, the second point, as far as when God shut Noah in, is that no one else would enter that ark. That time it came. The door was not going to be open again until it was acceptable to God. Noah could not open the ark door even if he wanted to. He had taken that time. He had seen all those people. He had seen them walking around. And by the way, when we look at Genesis 6:13, it says, and God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. When Noah was building this ark, this wasn't something of blind faith. He wasn't just saying, I'm going to build this ark because God told me to do it. He understood at the end of it what was going to happen. He understood that he was doing it to be obedient to God, but he also understood that his physical salvation, he understood that when it was done, that the rest of the earth would perish. Think about that for just a second. Noah would have no other opportunity or no other opportunity to try to save anybody else. That was over. We know when Christ comes or we leave this earth, that's it. There is no second chances. There are no do-overs. There are no, God, wait, give me one more time to try to get my life right. That's it. The door has been shut. As we think of those things, we look at Ecclesiastes 9:10, and it says, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, whither thou goest. The idea is, we're alive today. We have opportunities to do as God has commanded us today, this evening, right now. We're not given that opportunity past this time. We thank God that we do have this opportunity. And that's something we should all consider at this time. As we consider that, again, what is the soul of our state, or what is the state of our soul? Because when that time comes, the state of our soul is sealed, isn't it? So as we have this opportunity, if those who maybe have obeyed the gospel but have stepped back in the world, or there could be those that have never obeyed the gospel, or it could be that you're just needing prayers of the congregation. Whatever that need may be, please come as we stand and sing.
Someday you'll stand at the bar.